Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've had the opportunity to grab a quick lunch, and I can promise you intellectual nourishment for the next hour, high protein content, because we have an excellent panel for you. There's been a slight change in the program. As you'll notice, there's one empty chair here. Actually, that was meant to be mine. Mark Boxer, who was going to be the moderator, has come down with a stomach bug, and so it falls to me to be the moderator. This puts me in a slightly awkward position because I came here with a point of view to present and defend, and I was going to defend the media because I am a member of one, and now I have to force myself to be objective and neutral, and so the responsibility of defending the media now falls on Sarah, and if I'm a little more charitable to her than to folks on this side, that will be the reason. Before I get down to introductions, I want to quickly, by a show of hands, how many people here are teachers? Excellent, excellent. So my plan is to have a conversation with the panel for 30 minutes, 35, maybe 40, and then throw open to questions for discussions. Now, under normal circumstances in situations like this, I usually tell the audience that when the mic comes to you or when it's your turn, please don't take too much time making comments and get quickly to your questions. This time, I make an exception. I think, especially from those of you who are teachers, we'd like to hear your comments. We'd like to hear your analysis of how the media presents your profession and the challenges you face. But if you don't mind, just keep your comments as briefly as possible so that we can get in as many participants as we possibly can. Now the quick introductions. Sarah Sands is editor of the London Evening Standard. I'll keep the introduction short. The details are all in your guides. And she comes to us from London. The London Evening Standard actually does some quite sophisticated coverage of education, having lived in London and having been a consumer of the paper, I could say that. Then to my left, we have Martha Adams, who is a filmmaker, storyteller. You're all, I'm sure, like me, excited to see her movie tonight. She produced Girl Rising, the film that will be the highlight of the cultural activities this evening on the big tent, on the big screen over to my right. And then we have Raj Kumar, who is the boy wonder, and he founded and runs DevX, which I think the best description I've heard for it is that it is the Bloomberg of foreign aid, and everybody who has been involved in the development community knows how useful that is and how necessary it was for the community to have a Bloomberg-like service that everyone can consult. And so there it is. That's your panel. And one final point. As you know, the subject is media, but given the nature of the panel, I want to define media as widely as possible. We're not only talking about newspaper reporters or digital journalists such as myself. We're talking about filmmakers. We're talking about people like DevX that cover some of the same stories that traditional media does, but from a different lens and applying different skills. So in preparation for this discussion this morning, I spent some time talking to a number of teachers gathered here. And maybe one or two of you are in this room right now. And the first question I asked them was, what does the media most frequently get wrong about your profession? And I want to start by asking that same question of the panel. Sarah, can I start with you? What do you think the media gets most wrong about teachers? Martha?
I think it's about connecting the dots. I think most of us in the room now know the powerful correlation between educating girls and a nation's progress. But a lot of times I want the press, and I myself attempted to do it by making this film, to really dig deeper and understand the interconnectivity between all the different sectors of society, and so that when a girl receives one additional year of education, incredible things happen. Crop yields rise, gross national product goes up. And sometimes I think the media is missing that holistic view, and sometimes missing the most powerful story of all, which is that radical change is possible, great progress is possible.
Raj, what do you think?
Well, I agree with that completely, and I'd say in general we need more light and less heat in media coverage. A lot of media coverage, not just on education, but on lots of issues, tends to be looking for the conflict. And often education is perceived as a political issue. Yeah. And so there are questions about unions, or there are questions about taxes and funding for education. And frankly, there's a lot of other stories, bigger picture stories about education that I think get missed in that process. I had a journalism professor in college who taught us a great lesson. He showed us a video clip of coverage from the Vietnam War, kind of an iconic clip of a white American male reporter standing in front of a stream of Vietnamese refugees walking behind him. And he said, one can only imagine what is going through the minds of these refugees. And of course, the classic journalistic mistake there was he could have just turned around and asked them. Right? And I think that's some of that kind of basic journalism is what we need to do a bit more of. Less commentary, less opinion, less political fighting, and more, well, let's look at what's working. Let's look at who's doing what. Let's actually understand what some of these issues are on the ground, where it's happening, and I think it would change the dynamic dramatically.
Could I add, Bobby?
Sure.
That, when I was asked to make Girl Rising, at the very beginning of the project, excuse me, I took a moment, I took a pause, I spoke with my family, I looked at the issues, whether it was honor killings or some of the most tragic things happening around the world to girls. And I thought, can I do this? Can I spend the next few years of my life doing this? Well, I got out into the field, interviewed hundreds and hundreds of girls around the world, and I discovered there's amazing news out there. That there are innovative programs happening all around the world that stop the cycle of poverty in one generation. And that was an incredible surprise for me. And I wondered, why is the media not covering this?
Why is the media not covering it, Sarah?
I think sometimes the stories have to be exact, and also if they're too broad or they go on for too long. It's the other thing is the threshold of interest. Actually, what we've tried to do is to break those rules a bit, and I think it helps that though we have a very large circulation of 2 million readers, it's a community, so it's a capital city, and so having thought that you shouldn't be engaged because you're detached and you're only there to observe and find stories which, as you say, tend to be conflict. We tried a new thing, which was to say, here's a problem in London, and it started with a story because that's easier. So it was a statistic that 1 in 4 11-year-olds weren't read or write in London. So you think, this is a great modern city, and also found a lot of households where the only books were shopping catalogues. And then you think, well, so it's a global capital, so you've got, of course, a lot of immigration where the parents, haven't learned and aren't literate or haven't learned the language, and then that disadvantages the children. So is there something we could do instead of just sort of wringing our hands to say, well, you've got people in the city who could solve it? And actually we found a little scheme. It was a small charity, and what they do is bring in volunteers to read into schools. So then we found one school which was doing badly, said that's our flagship, let's try it. And these were just sort of volunteers, so they're kind of policemen and retired people, or actually sort of city workers who wanted to put something back and ask their companies if they could have those 2 hours off to go. So suddenly everyone became engaged, and it became a good story, because it was interesting because you wanted to see what would happen. And sure enough, the results soared in this school,
And then you had a sort of model which others then used. So I think around Europe it was used as a template, you know, picked up by Europe and the UN and so on. So it was a simple thing, but it was sort of contained. So it was one story, you know, of a statistic and one family that we spoke to, one school, and then from it, you know, you extrapolate and you can start doing things in a big way. So I think it is possible.
One of the things that the teachers I spoke to before, that I spoke to this morning, brought up was this, that the media, and again, the definition was quite broad. This included Hollywood, this included television, this included both sort of entertainment television as well as news and documentary, was that that either we take a very long lens where we look at the scale of the problem, and it's always a problem. Not enough schools, not enough teachers, not enough funding, lots of students are failing, quality is falling. Why aren't our, whatever, pick any country you are in, there's always another country that's doing better, unless you're Finland, and why aren't we doing as well as that country? So from a long lens, education always looks like a problem. So that's one way the media examines it. The other is a very, very sharply focused lens on one super teacher, one teacher who's doing an amazing job, typically in extraordinarily difficult circumstances in a slum in some poverty-stricken part of the world, or an incredibly difficult school in Harlem where violence is very high. And this is the Hollywood narrative of the teacher who comes in and changes everybody's lives. And whereas both these kinds of stories are important, it is important to look at it's important to take the 30,000-foot view, and it is also important, we are here after all, to celebrate the achievement of individual teachers. It doesn't always relate to the average experience of the average teacher, and those stories don't get told. How do you get past that? How do you find a way to tell stories about everyday teachers, everyday challenges, everyday successes, and yet make that interesting, make that sort of consumable for the average consumer? Do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So we love Cinderella stories. We love rags to riches stories. And by the way, Sarah, I could be sitting over there with you. So I've worked in media for a long time, and I know what we're up against, whether it's ratings or, you know, the Kardashians on another channel. So I get the realities of it. But the truth is, extraordinary things can happen in everyday life. You can be the teacher who starts that amazing project in the Dharavi slum, but you can also be the teacher that stays home in Cincinnati and does something remarkable right there inside your classroom. And I think for media, we need to not be afraid of that. We need to find how to tell that remarkable story within what might be viewed as kind of an ordinary location or environment. So through Girl Rising, what we've done, we were under a lot of pressure. We told, in the original film, there's 9 stories. We were pressured to cover that girl who climbed Mount Everest, or the girl who's the first Olympian to represent her country. And that wasn't the purpose of Girl Rising. Girl Rising is about finding everyday role models, the person right next door who is standing up, being courageous, and finding a new path to empowerment. Because viewers then, if they watch a Cinderella story, they might say, you know what, that's amazing, but I can't see myself in that story. So I think there's power in making relatable role models, shining a light on them, making them into stars.
What do you think?
Well, I'm just remembering I was at a panel at the Clinton Global Initiative right after the earthquake in Haiti. And the CEO of Google was on this panel, and he was saying, you know, we have this huge opportunity. Obviously, it's a huge tragedy, but all these schools are decimated. Let's get tablet computers in, and let's totally reimagine the educational system in Haiti. And me, being someone a bit outside the education world, thought, that's a pretty exciting idea. It's a very attractive idea. And I think the reality, though, now that we've tried to report on this a bit at DevX, and we've gone out and interviewed people, and I've been to some villages in Ethiopia and asked some people running projects, why aren't you using tablet computers? There's pretty good reasons why not. I think my point is that there are 2 sort of trapdoors for media coverage. One is the everything is a crisis, we can never get out of this, and I think people just tune out when they hear that. It's kind of, you were saying, so much about problems. I think even the way this panel was phrased about a learning crisis, even if that's true, it's problematic from a media perspective to present it as always it's a crisis. The other trapdoor is the silver bullet and the exciting new whiz-bang technology that's going to change the way we all learn. I think those stories can work if there's a broader framework. And I look at how business gets covered, right? I mean, there's so many stories about companies that may not directly impact your life or your own work, but they're still interesting. And the business news covers them all the time. And the way they do that successfully is they draw connections. The reporting sort of suggests, well, here's something that's going on in some new Silicon Valley startup that could someday affect a whole industry. Isn't that interesting? Or affect many people's lives, or maybe even your own. And I think we need that in education. It's a big enough industry, certainly. And learning, if you look at it that way, it touches everyone's lives, not just children. So can't we somehow change the frame of the way we look at education from stories about schools and teachers to something much broader? And in that way, maybe be able to accommodate many more stories than what we see today.
I think sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Information in the absence of emotion, it makes you smarter, right? But it doesn't necessarily inspire you to do something, to take action. So I think it's finding that beautiful balance between information and emotion so that you get the results that you want. I mean, through Girl Rising, for example, our stories, their information is there so that you learn, you know the statistics, you understand, but there's also a very powerful story that literally makes you care as much about the girl in the story as you do your own daughter at home. And that girl is in Nepal and you live in Washington, D.C. So I think it's about breaking down those barriers, not being afraid to make people care, and making sure that there's information every step of the way that makes the viewer smarter.
Just to pause. Excuse me, you were right at the end. You're sitting right in front of the clock. If you don't mind, yeah, that's great. Thank you. I need the visual clues occasionally. Thank you. So Sarah, how do you tell that story? How do you tell a story that addresses the problems, the challenges of classrooms everywhere, every day, and yet make it something that your readers will want to read?
Well, actually, I think you can do both the story of education itself and what's working, and you can make it inspiring and introduce emotion into it. And I think, so for instance, on education, there was a very radical education secretary called Michael Gove in London who came up with these sort of new ideas, forced them through, which is always a difficult thing, 'cause as we know, it's the bureaucracy that sort of stops you. Some people thought he was great, some people didn't. But as a result of a whole new way, a whole shake-up of education, there was in London, suddenly it went from the worst performing bit of the country to the best. So people were very interested actually in the theory of new schools opening and that people could open them themselves. So actually the theory or the business of schools became a very interesting story. On the inspiration, actually we did a front page picture quite recently which did very well, and it was Michelle Obama visiting a school, sort of some girls, and she was just saying, come on, you can do it, I did it, sort of thing. So it was just their faces, but it was just the front page saying sort of girls, it was girls really, and just the sort of, you could see how inspired they were, and you could see that it had changed them, though nothing had happened except someone had spoken to them. And so that sort of feel-good thing, which I think you could also bring a bit of that sense of wonder to the subject themselves. So for instance, we have something each year that we hold a big event to celebrate the most influential people in London. Now you can choose who those people, who the media decides to celebrate is up to them. You don't have to do it's a bit of ratings, but you can actually say, we think these people are interesting. And so we did a sort of science-based party event at this new Francis Crick Institute for Medical Research. So Stephen Hawking was there. It was, even though it was basically a building site, everyone's going, Francis Crick, this is amazing. Because you had somehow the idea of what could happen. So it was just potential. Well, everyone just looked at basically a lot of scaffolding. And this year we're going to have it. It's the new Zaha Hadid Maths Gallery at the Science Museum. So it's the same thing. It's not quite finished. But, already, so I'm just making lists of great mathematicians. I love all this sort of, I love this idea that they're the only people that can agree on what's beautiful is one thing said about mathematicians. So somehow the sort of romance of what they do, you can impart, and I think the media, should. So I think part of it's being very arts-based, but trying to bring some of those subjects to life. Actually, I think you can do without, sacrificing your journalistic credentials.
So one of the interesting, another interesting point that came up for discussion this morning is that there is too much. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. There's too much comparative data, if you like. There's too much of schools in this country are not doing as well as schools in that country, and this education system is better than that education system, and the Finns have it right, or the Koreans have it right, and so on. And that reflects a lack of understanding on the part of the media in the realities of their own home country and the realities that the teachers face. And that also sets, irresponsibly, that sets sort of impossible standards. Because even if you allow, and you might not, but even if you allow that, let's say you live in the UK and Finland schools are doing better than British schools, it is not something that can be solved overnight. But by presenting it as that kind of a competition, you're putting pressure on the school systems and on individual teachers, because they then are being asked by parents. Well, I read in the paper, or I saw on television that, or I saw this documentary that shows these Korean kids are great at math. What are you doing wrong with my children that my kids are not as good as they are? Can you talk a little bit about how you, because you're not traditional media, how you cover education differently from us?
Yeah, basically our philosophy is to kind of stick to our knitting, which is we write for an audience of development professionals. So the people who work at the Gates Foundation or the World Bank or UNICEF or at the nonprofit organization or the charity or the philanthropy, that's our audience. Yeah. We've got about 1 million professionals and aid workers around the world who read us. So we know they know a lot more than we do, a lot more than we do at many of these issues, and so the bar is pretty high. We've got to report for them in a pretty sophisticated way. And they want to know, if you're running a project, an education project in a particular place, what value can we add in talking about that project or talking about some new approach? And so that's the frame that we take. And I think actually that kind of more sophisticated reporting is partly what's needed just in the mainstream in general. And I think there is an audience for it. I was telling you before the panel, so this is not only in public, that I think Quartz does a fantastic job of this. I think part of it is that you are not dumbing down the issues that you report on. And education is one of those stories where we dumb it down at our own peril. And so I actually think the comparative data that you presented at the beginning as a negative could be a positive. The presentation this morning at the opening plenary I thought was excellent, and that used a lot of comparative data, but there was a lot of context.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of analysis.
Also, it was a very sophisticated audience.
It was, but I actually think there's more sophistication in audiences in general than we give them credit for. And the bigger problem we have is not that audiences don't want sophisticated material, it's that there isn't really a business model for it in most cases. So that many media outlets feel like, well, we can't spend a lot of money on that kind of expensive investigative or analytical reporting because who's going to pay for it? But once you figure out that model, as I think Quartz has to a degree, and there are others who have too, I think then you can start to support this kind of journalism, which is ultimately what's needed. It would be great if there was a sophisticated discussion about what your community's testing results are versus another community or another country at a sophisticated level about why. Not as you're saying, tell the teachers they should do something differently tomorrow, but at a sophisticated level about all of the inputs. I think that would be a good thing. And I don't see how we get to better policy if we don't have that discussion.
Sarah, can I ask you, in the Evening Standard's coverage of education, to what degree is it informed by consultation with teachers? And I don't mean interviewing them as subjects for a story, but just in understanding what their landscape looks like from their point of view.
Well, our education correspondents will be in touch with both teachers and certainly the universities as well. So you're getting the new, theories and research and so on. Maybe we should do more. Actually, one thing that just helps us as a sort of discipline is because we produce this book that goes with this most influential people in London. Each reporter has to work out who's good in that field and talk to them. So we do have that's a means for doing that. But maybe we shouldn't. Actually, and I think what did happen a bit, and that was the sort of bad thing I think about the education revolution, was that everything had to be about parents. There was a slightly sort of anti-teacher in a way mood because they were standing in the way of change in some way because one thing is they know what works and what doesn't. So, things would be thrown at them and curriculums kept getting changed and in the end they got fed up and demoralized, as happens a bit in the health service and so on. So I think you do need to, you certainly need to keep in touch with what's going on and what they think, although I think that can't be everything because, in the same way, journalists shouldn't have a monopoly on how the media's run.
Do you think that there is a room for teachers' voices to be heard directly without the framing that's applied by journalists? I mean, as columnists or as consultants to the editorial process?
Yes, we do run some as columnists. There was a head teacher called Anthony Selden, who then became a whole sort of educational sort of philosopher and introduced this rather radical idea of sort of mindfulness amongst children. I think even before Ariana Huffington, he was so early on this. But so I think the things that get discussed about the effects of education on children, we certainly whether you hothouse them too much, and those are obviously more nice problems to have. But so at that end, I think you certainly get teachers. And I know the Sunday Times, I think the editors here, and education features quite largely there. So some of it's space. You're all fighting for space, and it's the issue of the day and so on. But yeah, if teachers can write journalism, then of course they're welcome.
Did you have a thought?
I always have something to say.
No, go ahead.
We've listened to a lot of teachers. More than 3,000 educators have downloaded our curriculum in over 158 countries around the world. And a lot of times what they tell us is that they're fully aware of the issue, they're fully aware of the complexity that exists in the world, but they don't have the tools at their fingertips. And so every step of the way, we've kind of taken all the content inside Girl Rising, not just the film, but all of the additional content that we accumulated over the last 7 years, and have helped them repurpose it. So Girl Rising can become curriculum in history, it can become curriculum in English Lit, it can be an after-school program, it can be a theatrical program, it can be a parent-teacher program. So it's also part of keeping pace with the teachers' needs and making sure that they have the tools they need to stay ahead of the kids. Because a lot of times what I'm seeing are the kids, they're growing up in YouTube, they're way out ahead of us. I was just in the lobby of a school in LA where you walk in and there's a huge map of the world, and every child had a pin on their house, and it was connected by yarn to a different place in the world, and it was a project that they were working on. So that's the mantra of that school, and so I think the teachers are just trying to keep pace with this very global outlook.
I think media may need to keep pace too. I mean, that's another thing where a lot of our conversation so far, including my own, is thinking about how education is today. But it seems likely, as I listen to lots of experts in education at this conference, that we're at an inflection point. We may be seeing a radical shift in the way education is delivered and the modalities of learning and the whole system. And if that's the case, that may drive more media interest. But it means we need to have that more sophisticated level of coverage.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's time we heard from some teachers at this point, because we're all sort of talking from our slightly different perspective, but none of us is a practitioner, if you like. Is there a teacher here who would like to sort of give us their opinion on how your profession is covered in the media. Let me narrow that down by saying, maybe give us one or two examples of egregious failures on the part of the media, and then, if you don't mind indulging me, one or two examples of successful coverage of your profession. Did you want to start?
Yes, we have a media rep.
There's a mic coming?
We have a public relations or media rep in my district. We have about 2,000 teachers, and unless the teacher herself or himself calls the media rep, there's no idea, she has no idea what we're doing in the classroom. I think it could be a better connection if the principal were to keep the pulse on what's going on and send flyers to the media rep, or if the media rep, in one district I worked in, I headed up the newsletter and I had a media rep in every building, and that worked out very well because they know what's going on in the building and you can celebrate all the small successes that really do happen at least one a week in every building.
Can we get the mic here, please?
Hi, so I'm based in Buckinghamshire in the United Kingdom, just outside of London, and although I work as a school improvement advisor now, I worked as a teacher for a long time. And I think for me, blogs is a great thing. There's lots of teachers who I follow blog posts of, and I think that's really insightful. But I think one of sort of my bugbears personally is really about, I think teaching is something as a profession that everybody has got an opinion on. And I think a lot of the time, I think it stems back to the status of teachers, and I think how that's viewed in society. I mean, I've had friends for years and years who'll say, oh, you only work 9 to 3, and it must be great. And I think that whole thing that goes with it. So I think in terms of media coverage, I personally feel, on the whole, teachers get a very hard time, a very difficult time. And I think it's because, everybody feels like they've got something to say because they've been through the process, yet we all go and visit a doctor at some point, but then don't give advice on how doctors should operate on a day-to-day basis. So I think because of that, and then also bearing in mind the retention rates that we have in teaching and recruitment at the moment as well, I think it's an issue really in terms of how much pressure we are putting on teachers to perform, especially when we're comparing them to other countries. Because I would argue, well, what is it that we're actually measuring? Because in my opinion, our education system is so outdated, and most of them are globally and aren't progressive enough, as we've been talking about in the conference so far, in terms of what the world needs and what it will need in the future. So again, the media's sort of role in that, really.
Yeah, choose silence that phone, please, whoever it is. Yeah, and please, mic here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nadia Lopez. I am a principal from New York City. I started a school in Brownsville, Brooklyn. So for me, when we talk about the media, we tend to be covered in a negative light. Our proficiency rate is really low in our particular community. We have the highest rate of children who become incarcerated because there's only a 14% college. It's children going into college. 32% of the children are graduating from high school. So when we look at the teachers or the way the narrative is crafted around education in that particular neighborhood, the first place they blame are the schools and the teachers. And so what I find to be the problem is we're not engaging the educators to talk about what is actually the problem in the community, the lack of resources, the lack of money, in order to support the type of services that we need, because I have a 32% special needs population. It wasn't until my story was covered through Humans of New York, where one of my scholars said that I influenced him, that I was able to capitalize on that platform and start to push the narrative that says there are phenomenal teachers throughout all of our schools, but we have to start creating a platform that actually says that we have remarkable educators and what are some of those gaps. So what we do at our school is I actually manage a lot of social media at the school, because I feel like you have to create your own content and you have to be in control of the narrative. So whether it's Mott Hall Bridges, any one of those handles, I've created a campaign I created a campaign called Occupy Schools because I think that we need to start showing the faces of teachers and educators in general that are doing extraordinary things in communities that are often seen as disenfranchised and disadvantaged.
Thank you for that. So that raises an interesting point. Yeah, thank you. That raises an interesting point. When we say media, that's the newest iteration of it, which is social media. And social media, at least in theory, gives control to everybody, including to the teachers. And we've heard an example here of how a teacher in a school can take charge of their own narrative using social media. I'll come to you in just one second. But if someone else has a story to tell about using social media to take control of the narrative, you do?
My name is Johannes Visser from the Netherlands. I'm half my time I'm an educational journalist, the other half I'm a teacher, high school teacher, which is a good combination, I think.
Yeah.
And it's for an online platform with a business model, so you might have to talk. I think there's some hope in online journalism for educational journalists. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else on social media, a thought on that? Raj, what do you think?
Well, I think in a way we're all journalists, or we're all in the media at least in this era. It's a complicated ecosystem. It's not just sort of the newspapers and the TV channels and then social media. Everything is kind of connected in a sense. But there are elements of that ecosystem that require traditional journalism. We need someone who knows how to do journalism, which is in itself a discipline, just like teaching is a discipline. And we need people who will go out and do the in-depth research and really understand an issue. It was brought up earlier that there are these narratives out there. I know this because my mother was a teacher, that teaching is not a cushy job, but there's a narrative out there that it is a cushy job, and these are like zombie narratives. You can't kill them, they just keep coming back, right?
Yeah.
And the only way to get rid of these ideas, in the presentation this morning, the idea that Asian school systems, East Asian school systems are all about memorization, but it's actually not true. The only way to do it is to find the data, investigate it, present it over and over and over in an in-depth way, and then it can reverberate through social media and people can discuss it. But that system, that ecosystem doesn't work without the journalism at the core.
Well, thank you for that vote of confidence in my profession. Sorry, yes, you had a point you wanted to make.
Hello, my name is Ken Imperato, Deputy Principal of an American school here in Dubai, originally from the States. And I was wondering what the media can do to cut through some of the political agendas, both at the localized level, state or provincial level, national ministerial level, where political agendas are driving the way the data is presented and fed to the public. Even at the OECD, World Bank level, if you're looking at international comparisons and you're looking at PISA or TIMSS results, and you're comparing Lebanon, which has about 50% of its schools government, 50% private, to the USA, where 88% are public and 12% are private, or UAE, where it's inverse to the USA. Just that relationship between private and public schools is a confounding variable in what the data really means. Similar with Finland, the homogeneity, economic lower disparities and homogeneity of faces and voices versus very, very diverse places like here in the UAE or in the United States. That's a confounding variable in whatever meaning you put into the statistics that come out. And so my question to you is, while the media can't be psychometricians and validity experts of studies, but what can they do to really share the information correctly with the public to put the proper meaning on the data that comes out?
Sarah, what are your thoughts? Are we relying too much on gee whiz data and not reading between them?
Yes, if I think of just such a straightforward reporting, you always bear in mind who your sources are. I know on transport I can tell which stories have come from the unions, which have come from the management, and so on. And within that, you need to take that into account. And every story should have one person says, another person says such things. So I think in one way it's I guess the difference is just the sheer amount of data now. That's what's changed everything. You know, before you could just measure it up. You can get overwhelmed now, but I think then journalists just have to be better.
Did you have a thought on how you think we ought to be approaching these stories?
I'd like to see more highlights in threats to validity of the data that we're putting out here. The fact of the matter is, Finland's context and the way they do business there is radically different than in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. And I don't think it's fair for the public to not understand the data and what it really means, because there can be very, very good things going on in teaching at the localized level, and it just doesn't come to the surface. And so I think, to the point of Ms. Adams, who is working maybe at a more documentary level, where you get to really dig deeply into qualitative and ethnographic type of research, that there's a greater use for that type of reporting, I think, than some of the 4-minute soundbite reporting. And of course, it's resource intensive, and it's harder to produce, of course. But I'd like to see that type of reporting, rule the day, rather than the drive-by data that we tend to run with erroneously, I think. And policymakers make policy based on these data, such as No Child Left Behind in the States, and other types of policy decisions.
I'm going to steal your drive-by data quote. I like that.
Bobby, can I just say something?
Yes, and
Of course.
then we'll have.
Yeah, sorry, but just a little bit to your point and to what was said over here is that, when we started to make a film about the power of girls' education, nobody in their right mind would finance us. I mean, who's going to go see a film about girls' education? Nobody, right? So if we had gone along the conventional track to meet with either TV executives or film distributors, we would have gotten nowhere. The story would have never gotten out. So it's really about finding your strategic partners and figuring out how to scale the message as far as possible. So if it weren't for, say, the Intel Corporation, in our case, who were truly visionaries on this issue, they were the ones who took a chance with us and said, you know what, you're not going to find the funding elsewhere. We're going to fund this because we're going to help get this message out. So part of what we're talking about here is distribution, eyeballs. How do you find your strategic partners to help pool your base?
And my contribution will really be based on my bias. So I just want to be upfront. And I heard your comment, Kuma, when you said, why can't we follow some of the way in which the private sector position? So I'm not a teacher, I'm from the private sector, and I know how it works. What I think media can make a huge contribution is just to make sure that you tell the world how having a teacher is very important. How having a teacher has created the chief executive that is doing so much innovative things out there in the private. How having a teacher is responsible for you as a media person being able to articulate the issues the way you do. Position the profession in a way that anybody who's out there and thinking, what should I do? They can say, when I grow up, I want to be a teacher. That's what I believe media is asked to do. The statistics, the information, it's normal, they can report it. It's just the strategic positioning of a profession that's being so put out in the market in a negative, and it's destroying the globe, quite frankly. That's my view.
Can I hear from you again? I'll come to you in just a second. Excuse me, can you get the mic here, please, to this gentleman? I want to ask you, because you're both a teacher and a journalist, and you write for digital media.
Yeah.
You said something at the end of your remarks at the previous time, where you said that there's hope in digital journalism.
Yeah.
Tell me how you write about teaching different from how, let's say, Sarah might write.
What I try to do is to look at how policy from our government gets into the classroom. So I try to do both. I try to describe what the policy is from our department, and then I try to see how that works out in the classroom. That's the combination I try to make.
Give us an example.
For example, in the Netherlands, we have data that show that our best students aren't really performing very well. So the last couple of years, our government said we have to do more for those excellent students. So I can see in my school what happens, and I can see how teachers respond to the government, and I can tell stories from what happens at schools, because the media seem to think that nothing really happens, and I've heard it before, that schools are the same as 20 years ago, and that's just not true. We're taking small steps at a time, and I think I want to show that we are thinking about our own education as teachers. That's the story I want to tell.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. You have
My name is Amal Al-Rada, and I'm the Director of Fundraising at Dubai Cares. The issue that we are facing as a nonprofit organization is basically how to position education as an urgent cause that people in the community need to contribute to. We've launched several campaigns over the years, and unfortunately what tends to happen is that our campaigns are overshadowed by a crisis that is happening somewhere in the world or an emergency response, and the media attention actually is diverted towards covering what's happening in that specific area, which tends to affect the level of funding that we generate out of the campaign and the level of awareness that we would like to spread. So my question is, how can we make our story more exciting to attract the media to cover it? And at the same time, should organizations also invest in non-traditional media tools, such as, for example, the social media? Because we know that the world is connected more than ever now through social media, and it's a free tool for most of the nonprofit organizations that run with limited resources and capacity. So should this be a tool that nonprofit organizations should consider investing in?
Yeah. I'm going to take that on myself, because I keep throwing to Sarah, and that's a little unfair that you have to carry the whole burden. I'll tell you this, that social media is so. I am an editor at Quartz, which is a digital media outlet, and I know this is true for all of my writers and correspondents, whatever their topic terrain that they happen to be covering, whether it's education or energy, whatever the topic is, that social media now gives them access to many more principles, and I don't mean principles as in principles of school, but protagonists than was possible when I was coming up in journalism. When I was coming up in journalism, when I needed to hear from a teacher, I would have to go and find a teacher, talk to them, and then there was a chance that the teacher I found may not be the right person, then go and find a second teacher and a third, and finally get the story I was trying to get. Nowadays, correspondents can, if the person who covers education for Quartz has in their Twitter feed, they're following 100 different people who are commenting about education, writing about education, and quite often, more than 50% of the cases are educators themselves. And therefore, someone said earlier that they were able to use a blog very efficiently. I think that opens up much more potential for teachers, for educators, for schools to tell their story, to take control of their narrative, either reaching directly to the larger community or strategically reaching those who can amplify those stories, so journalists and members of the media. And that's a very, very effective tool. And I imagine this must be true for your colleagues as well, those who cover education. They're probably following on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, they're probably following dozens and dozens of teachers themselves.
Absolutely. No, it's a terrific resource. It's completely opened up the world. And I think we're very lucky to be in those times. I think just on the status of teachers, which I do think is the absolute sort of key issue, I do think we should work harder at that. I do think the status is actually higher than you think. We have a system of Teach First, which is meant that I think it's now the second most popular job for graduates to go into. I think it's just sort of respecting, as you say, the sort of data. I think naturally newspapers or all media tend to deal in extremes, and so we go for the superhead or we go for the terrible failure. And you're right, it's the sort of steady, incremental workload of good, decent people devoted to what they do. So I think we just have to find a way of somehow bringing that into journalism.
I'll take a quick poll. Of those of you who are teachers here, how many of you, how many of your schools have a social media outreach? How many of them have Twitter accounts? Okay, that's a pretty decent number, I think. So we had a couple of questions here, and then we'll have a couple of questions there. Let's start with you.
Okay. I want to say something about the use of social media in describing school and school reforms. I'm from the Ministry of the Italian Ministry of Education, and I'm the media relation responsible. We created an account 2 years ago, and we use it a lot to understand what teachers are saying, what are they talking about, and we use also it to talk with teachers. And we saw that using that account, our school, the number of our school's accounts grew and grew up a lot, because they know that there is someone who's looking what they say and who's talking with them, maybe not all the time talking in peace each other, because we are the ministry and they are the teachers or schools. But we launched the reform, national reform, 1 year ago, called La Buona Scuola, and we also launched an hashtag with La Buona Scuola, and it became one of the most discussed hashtags for many weeks. So I think social media could be very important.
How many followers does this account have?
Not very much followers, because in Italy our institution are not much followed, because in Italy we don't use so much Twitter. It is about 50,000 followers, but
and most of them are teachers?
Teachers, students, more teachers than students, and common citizens. And we also follow what they talk about every day, because we launched some issues, and we immediately understand if they are interested in, and we create communities around these items.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. My name is Selim Eddi. I work for a software company. So when you're talking about data and big data, I had to sort of say a few words. By the way, we're really interested in the youth unemployment issue, and there is a report coming out I saw on that talks about 1 billion people, young people who will be sort of in need of a job. So the role of media here is extremely important, because if you want to touch 1 billion person, it's not a program that will touch them. It is a movement. It will take a movement, and you have the power to enthuse the community, enthuse all the stakeholders. The public sector, the private sector, the people sector. It's extremely important, your role to make sense out of all this. Now, one observation about mainstream media, you mentioned that you need real journalists. We agree to that, we subscribe to that. And what we're observing is, of course, the mainstream media and the social media coming together to actually have an effect and an impact on that movement, right? To explain that changes minds about a school in New York or anything else. So it's very important to have the media mobilized to actually target this area. By the way, you will be surprised, but we know exactly what needs to be done to help solve the youth unemployment, right? The main issue is far too many stakeholders, and we need the media to enthuse the community to get there. That's the first point, and your role is extremely important. Second role is, you've touched on it, is how to analyze this data, the big data, the structured and unstructured data, because it comes at a high speed, high velocity, high variety, and high volumes, right, the 3 Vs. So how to extract value out of all this? Today the tools are also here, and to help the government sort of make the right decisions and enact the right policies and roll out the right programs. But even with the best policies and the best programs in the world, nobody will use them unless there is the proper sort of communication campaign that you're responsible for. So your role, again, is extremely important, and we're looking at best practices that where you can spread the word, whether it's going to be a leaderless movement or with leaders, we don't know. But but your role is extremely important.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions from that side.
Hello, Martin Ivans, editor Sunday Times of London. I'd just like to support the work of what the media do. If there's nothing worse than the media, and we have many, many failings, it's the absence of the media, I think, is to be decried. It's no accident, for instance, that in a city like London, where Sarah's newspaper flourishes and where the national media is based, that standards have improved no end in comparison to the rest of the United Kingdom. And it's, again, no accident that it's in those areas of the United Kingdom where the press is less critical, less intrusive, that standards have not improved. So I think it is important, that we're there and that we're engaged. A lot of the impetus behind the reforms that Sarah was alluding to in our country, I think, came from direct agitation from journalists, not only in print, but to some of the principals concerned, that people like our Prime Minister Tony Blair and his successors couldn't go to a dinner party without being pursued and hounded by journalists who are, after all, parents too, to say there is something wrong with our schools. I cannot afford to send my children private. What are you going to do to make state schools better? So I think that's one illustration of what the media can do. And the other one, I just wanted to take up comments from the rest of the panel. We do need symbols, I think, just as in the realm of politics, somebody like Martin Luther King or Alexander Solzhenitsyn had a sort of a great moral effect on how we perceive the world. I think somebody like Malala, who my paper has taken up very much. One of my journalists, Christina Lamb, has written her biography. I think we do sometimes an outstanding individual can be helpful and can sort of give the world a wider lesson, and that's where perhaps we can be helpful. We may be a blunderbuss in what we do, but sometimes we hit the right target.
Indeed. We'll take one question there. We're running very short on time, so I'll make that the second to last one, and then this gentleman in the pinstripes right here.
I'd just like to say personally, because I'm a student, I study in the Westminster School, Dubai. The woman sitting next to me is my teacher, actually, and she's the digital leader of our school. And I find that teaching is a job that is highly underrated, and people find it almost as if it's a very downgraded job. It's self-degrading. In our school, we have Teachers' Day every year, and it's a worldwide thing. But it almost seems as if that title of Teachers' Day has come down to just for namesake. In our school, we do a practice where we have the students take up the roles of all the main roles as vice principal, principal, even the teachers. Last year, I got to be a chemistry teacher, and this year, I was the vice principal of the school. And we saw the amount of work that went into it. For that particular day, we literally ran the school. And it is almost unbearable to take that amount of pressure. My mother is a teacher, so I know exactly how much pressure she goes through. And every day she sits for long hours, trying not to just make herself an influential person to help others or to help the students, but also to help me become a better person, the teachers around her become a better person, and somehow influence the next generation that leave the school. Because my mom taught in India many years ago. The batch from 1981 still remembers her to this day. 22 years ago, she taught a batch, her first teaching job, and they still remember her. And it's that kind of inspiration I would like to see the media covering. It's very unusual to find a documentary or a film based solely on the teacher, the inspiration that the teacher creates. Because a teacher doesn't just teach a student. A teacher can be a parent, can be an inspiration, can be a role model. Because for those 6 hours or 7 hours in a day, that teacher is pretty much the parent. It's the person that brings up that child, is able to inculcate certain values in that student. So I'd just like to see that media covering something as important as that. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Alexander Nikitic. I run a Carfax Education Group, a group of schools, other educational enterprises, tutoring agencies around the world. Actually, one comment and one question. The comment is that here in the UAE, I've never seen anywhere in the world education stories featuring so prominently in the national media. Pretty much every other day, it's front page stuff. And of course, I'd love to see that all over the world. But the question I have is that, of course, media deals in stereotypes. But one stereotype I'm concerned with is when we think of about sort of mass education and elite education. And often media stories on education are about social mobility, disadvantage, right in social ills, which is, of course, very valid concerns. But to me, it seems there aren't enough stories on the elite education, on when education works very well. And I wonder whether the media can address that, because there is a lot that can be learned from when education works very well. And when we can abstract from the sort of social functions of education and just remember about the key thing about it, that's a means of educating individual children and providing as good a future for them as can be.
Anyone here want to address that question?
Well, I would just say on the elite education, slightly as Martin Ivans just referred to, that, you know, in London, again, such a global capital, what the value of at the top education, you know, apart from property, is the highest. So, you know, where the child got to school, the comparison with, you know, with other places, it's you know, almost excessively sort of raked over. But it is interesting. But then you get back to your comparisons, and you know, in stereotypes, it always ends up when will we all be just run by Chinese, because we'll never be as good as they are. But I think you know, we probably need to do it in this. We slightly need to get over that into. I think it was the Tiger Mother book, wasn't it, that everyone sort of took up as in a sort of cultural way, and actually probably we need to look more seriously at what's happening. But the, you know, the appetite for it is certainly there.
Chair, did you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea, though. I think it has to be handled carefully, because I think we already have too much of a money obsession in our media coverage, and I could see it easily becoming something like the coverage of the latest expensive car or the private jet. And, you know, part of the broader issue we're facing, I think, when we look at media coverage of education, is that inequality broadly is coloring the way societies look at these issues, and it becomes an us against them kind of debate. So you're right, I'm sure that there are things we can learn, but the context is really important. And that's part of what maybe the media is getting wrong right now, is that context, that it's reflective of these divisions we have in society. So we have to be cautious about that.
Well, I see we're running out of time, and I think there are people outside who want to come in for the next panel. I want to thank the audience first. Thank you, especially those of you, you who contributed to the discussion today. And I want to especially thank the panel for coming all the way and contributing. I hope you found the discussion stimulating, and that you're going away with some fresh thoughts and ideas. Thank you, everybody.